1 out of every 5 aviation accidents occurred during takeoff. The fact is, both takeoffs and landings continue to humble expert pilots and novices alike, and provide material for hours of hangar talk about technique and theory. And during a recent 10-year period, virtually half of all aviation accidents occurred during these 2 brief phases of flight. The better prepared you are, the less chance you'll appear in an accident statistic column. And that's why the Air Safety Foundation created this presentation on takeoffs and landings, the ups and downs of general aviation. Now, takeoffs and landings are part art and part science. The science comes from the physical laws that govern flight, the physics of lift, drag, and thrust, and meteorological phenomena, winds and updrafts and downdrafts that affect an aircraft. The art comes in the ability to use the experience, knowledge, and feel to adjust for the shifting conditions that make every landing and every takeoff unique. What about you? How prepared are you for aviation's ups and downs? When's the last time you really practiced takeoffs and landings? And when's the last time you practiced in less than ideal wind conditions? What performance parameters do you monitor when you practice them? What is the strongest crosswind you're comfortable landing in? And is it really that cross? Sometimes, after you do the calculation, a 15-knot wind turns out to have only a 6-knot crosswind component. How much do you really know about the takeoff and landing performance of the plane you fly? You have to judge your own answers to the questions. There is no runway traffic cop. It's up to each of us to maintain our proficiency and operate safely. Let's face it, some runways and weather conditions are harder to deal with than others. If your home field has a 5,000-foot runway and the wind never blows, you've reduced the odds of getting into trouble at either end of the flight. But we all use more than one airport, and they all have challenging winds from time to time. No airplane is immune to problems that could create an emergency on takeoff or landing. But surprisingly, the majority of takeoffs and landing accidents aren't caused by wind, weather, density, altitude, or runway length. They're usually due to lack of basic pilot skill, loss of control during these common but critical phases of flight. So, as pilots, we can't take any takeoff or landing for granted. At the same time, we have to be ready to manage the extra challenges encountered at many airports when getting on or off the ground. Obstructions, short fields, soft fields, wind gusts, crosswinds, hot days that effectively shrink the runway length we have to work with. Night operations that rob us of visual clues, or having the sun directly in our eyes at sunrise or sunset. We have techniques and procedures for dealing with all of these situations. Is it our training or a lack of exposure that accounts for the fact that only a small percentage of takeoff and landing accidents result from these adverse conditions? So, what about a normal takeoff and landing? You know, another windless day at the airport with the 5,000 feet of pavement. What do we need to consider in a situation like that? Okay, you're ready to take the active runway. There's no wind, no obstructions. You've got lots of pavement to work with, standard temperature and humidity, so what's there to think about? Let's start with the runway. Length is only one of the issues. If there's no wind and the field is non-towered, how do you select which direction to take off in? Would you base it on the direction you were flying, or think about what's lying off the departure ends, in case you have to put it on the ground after takeoff? Is there a slope to the runway? That will affect takeoff performance. Some runways are so sloped that pilots always take off downhill regardless of wind conditions. At other airports, you may have to decide if downhill with the wind is safer than uphill into the wind. Are there any rough spots in the runway you can avoid by favoring one side or the other? What about the runway condition? How's the braking action? Has it rained recently? Making it slick? If you have to stop your takeoff roll, that will become a factor. Runway surface condition is a factor cited in an impressive number of takeoff and landing accidents. What about the performance of the plane you're flying? What's the ideal rotation speed? And how do you know when you've reached it? So, as we can see, even a normal takeoff has several factors to take into account. And if you don't have these basics down for a normal takeoff or landing, you won't have the foundation to handle more complex and challenging situations. So let's start here. First of all, how do you know how your plane is supposed to perform? How long it's going to take to get airborne? How far to clear that tree? at the end of the runway that just happens to be exactly 50 feet tall. How do you know if it can clear that mountain that rises just past it? That's right, the POH, Pilot's Operating Handbook. Here are all the charts and graphs that let us calculate how the airplane is going to perform under specific conditions. The POH gives us all the numbers we need, right? Well, hang on a second. How do they get these numbers? Here's where they come from. The airplane manufacturer. And here's the airplane. Look at it. The paint's so glossy it looks like it's wet. The tires are perfectly inflated. Everything's lubed and brand new. The engine develops full compression. The rigging is correct. And here's the pilot, a meticulous professional who knows the airplane, knows all the physics of flight and all the tricks for getting max performance. A pilot who puts them into practice in the air every working day. That's the plane and the pilot behind the numbers, like a jockey on a thoroughbred. Now, of course, manufacturers want their performance numbers to look as good as possible, but they don't go for the absolute edges of the envelope in developing their figures. The fact is, the plane may perform better than the book indicates under certain conditions, because no heroic effort has gone into getting the absolute shortest landing distance or takeoff roll. The test pilot isn't dragging the plane in at the back end of the power curve and dropping it in on the runway to come up with the landing distance. The aircraft are operated normally. So, if they're operating the aircraft normally and we're operating the aircraft normally, why shouldn't we expect to duplicate the book performance figures? Let's start here, on the flight line. If these planes look like they're tired, they probably are. Look at those tires. If they're not properly inflated, it's going to cost you performance, not to mention jeopardize safety by increasing the chance of a blown tire. How old is your engine? Think it's developing as much power as it did when it was fresh? And what about all that extra weight that accumulates in the baggage compartment over the years? Bottom line, if it's not a new airplane, it's not going to perform like one.
Clear prop.